Hello and welcome to the West Ham Breakdown with me, Jack Elderton, and my mate Cal Goodall, in a week where West Ham lost 1-0 to Brentford. It's a really disappointing result, isn't it? And I think it came in a game where Brentford probably should have been out of sight in the first half. I think we can have some disappointment about the result after coming in at halftime 1-0 down and it just being a one-goal game, because I think we maybe just about did enough in the second half to squeeze something out, or to feel like we maybe deserved to squeeze something out. I mean, Kudus probably could have taken the big chance that fell his way. I think there's a big question mark over the decision for not to give a penalty when Bowen and Keane Lewis Potter tangled in the box, and there were some good things to take away from the second half. But ultimately, just talking about the result before we break into the performance, a 1-0 loss at home to Brentford it feels like a step back right now.
Yeah, 100%. I think given sort of the quality of performances that we've seen before under Potter in moments against opposition that I don't think it would be too unfair to Brentford to say were better quality opposition in Villa, Chelsea, etc. The teams he's played so far, this was probably the first one that we sort of earmarked on the calendar as cool. Also with the way that it had been phased in terms of they'd had the most amount of time on the training ground beforehand and the longest amount of time for the ideas to begin to be embedded within the team, more players fit, the best starting 11 he'd had available to choose from. Obviously the flip side of that being it's the first time they played together, so that does add a different dynamic to it. But yeah, ultimately I think approaching the game, circumstances considered, we felt quite positive that this would be the game where we really hoped to start to see things click, hoped to start to see some of the in-possession stuff against a side that were unlikely to ever want to dominate possession against us away from home. And unfortunately, we just didn't really see that. We saw, as you say, glimpses, certainly improvement in the second half. But even then, I would say that we looked a little bit impotent around the box in the second half in terms of the quality and volume of chances we created, something we'll break into in a bit more detail. But yeah, just a bit flat. And then I think when you look at the table coming out of the game and sort of the idea that we could have been close almost to 10th if we'd have won, and then now it's like we're actually one of the closest teams to the relegation zone again. So I know that's such a minor thing because it's the points that matter, and realistically we are quite significantly above the relegation zone at the minute. But just from an optics point of view, looking at the table and going, oh, we're still all the way down there, it's hard to feel excited after a game where we both felt we would have liked to have won. Well, obviously liked to have won. Would have hoped we could have won.
Yeah, I think it's one of those games which just changes the feeling so dramatically, doesn't it? You have these in a season. It's probably not right that we look at it in this way, and hopefully the group isn't looking at it in this way. But as fans, we do ultimately. I mean, this is the experience of being a football fan, and you have moments in a season where you're looking up to the teams above you, and moments in a season where you're looking down to the teams beneath you. And this is one of the moments where I think the fan base has shifted. You know, new manager comes in, performances improve. Maybe the results aren't quite there, but you're looking up. You're thinking we can catch. As soon as the fixtures change in our favour, we're going to start making ground up. And then you lose a game when the fixtures, change in your favour. And we say that. I mean, I've got to say just at this point that Brentford's performance here was absolutely fantastic. Thomas Frank's team doing brilliantly this season. Level of performance across the entire season has been super impressive, and they seem to be turning a corner in their away form just of late. That has been really poor across the season. It's been their weakest area, but I thought they were absolutely magnificent in the first half. Execution in the final third wasn't quite there, but up to that point, the two centre backs were sensational. Norgaard's performance in the middle was brilliant. The way that Mikkel Damsgaard rotated and then supplied the dynamic front three ahead of him. I thought Damsgaard's performance as an individual was just frankly outrageous in the first half. One of the best individual performances I've seen at the London Stadium this season, right up there. And then also kind of minor roles played by players like Vitaly Janelt, who showed a real understanding of where to move on the pitch to cause problems for our defensive structure. The kind of things that maybe we lack in midfield. So little runs to drag Kudus away, to create more space for a player like Van den Berg, to create opportunities for Lewis Potter to drive up the pitch really aggressively. They manipulated us very successfully. They're incredibly well coached, and you can see that have a real clear understanding of what they want to do. So a top level performance, but definitely one of those where it felt like the fixture list was changing, and suddenly you lose it, and you're looking down to the teams beneath you and thinking, oh, how many more results like that can we afford? Especially when, game afterwards, or on Sunday, the game afterwards for us, we've got Arsenal, and then you look at Sunday and you see the performance that Wolves put in away at Anfield. Didn't get the result, but an incredible second half performance where it really had kind of a long extended period of dominance at Anfield, and perhaps certainly will have come away feeling like they deserve more. And that's not the first time under Vitor Pereira that Wolves will be feeling that way. So when things like that happen, when Ipswich go and get a point down to 10 men for such a long period of the game, get a point against Aston Villa, a few things conspire, and it really does change the mood, and that makes it suddenly feel a really different place. It feels like a really different place being in the West Ham fan base at this moment. We should start to talk about exactly what happened and why it happened. I've already spoken about how well Brentford's dynamic front three was supplied, but God, did we create a few situations for them to supply them, didn't we?
Yeah. Well, I think it was obviously the goal came in the 4th minute, and it was shortly after our first corner of the game, which came in the 3rd minute. And before they'd even took it, I said, wow, very high here. We've got our 3 deepest players are basically on the edge of Brentford's box, ready to pick up any loose balls, which I get in a sort of let's suffocate the opposition and pen them in when the ball's nodded out and make sure we're first to it, and then we'll have another wave of possession while we've got almost equal footing in terms of bodies in the box rather than their defenders outnumbering us. So I see the logic, but if you couple that with whatever the pressing structure was post corner, you have to win at least the first or the second ball, and it felt like from thereafter the level of vulnerability that we were willing to take on when you weigh it up against the threat that Brentford present in those situations just felt like quite an unequal balance, and one that was incredibly risky, especially to be taken so early in the game. I suppose you give yourself more time to get back in the game if you do fall foul of it, but then we saw it coming again and again and again, and it was clearly just the way that we wanted to attack corners, and that's fine. I've got an appetite for risk, but I think you do also have to have a sort of element of who we're up against. Oh, it's Visser, Sharda and Burmo. Maybe leaving ourselves so open to the counter is not the best idea. But then it came not just in corners as well. I think the pressing in general wasn't especially effective, and probably too front-footed. I'll let you come on to that and discuss from a tactical point of view. But I think just from a personnel point of view, I think it makes sense to be slightly more pragmatic when you're facing up against Brentford, who are on their day one of the best counter-attacking sides in the league when they want to be.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of bodies when it comes to how we attack. I think I would talk more about, I think with the corner, you can look at it in those terms, but ultimately I think we had opportunities to press better, to make fouls, to get closer than we did. I think Souček can get closer. I think Alvarez can get closer. I think Emerson can win the duel. I think Areola maybe can do better as well with the save. I'm not a goalkeeper analyst by any way, shape or form, and so I'm not really qualified to speak about it, but it just didn't look right. I think the shot wasn't brilliant. I don't know why his weight goes so heavily to one side. He ends up having to save it with his feet, and then it's kind of all gone wrong from that point onwards. And it's kind of a disappointing one to concede when you look at how many poor finishes there were from Brentford in this game, and you think that was probably another not so great finish, and you just think if we could have dealt with just that one as well, we could have done something like we did against Man United, really, where you ride through a first half where you think could be a really different scoreline, and a lot of that hinges on poor finishing from the opposition, and then you get into a position to attack the game in a second period with a few changes. So kind of disappointed with that. I think the goal was a bit different to a lot of the rest of it, where I think, yeah, you have to look at the way that we use the ball. I mean, the way that we use the ball didn't help us at all in the game. We were too rushed, too panicked, too insistent to try and create a chance quickly. Too many balls into the box, and actually it's about having patience in possession. We often talk about kind of progressive quality and the need for it in midfield. Sometimes it's about that, and sometimes actually it's about just taking the ball in the midfield and playing it straight back to a centre back, and just being able to show that kind of control in a game, and we didn't have that. I think game state is obviously a big part of it. We go down one down so early in the match, and we obviously want to resolve it. I think Potter was very generous in the way that he spoke about it afterwards, saying, you know, that can happen to any team. You know, you go 1-0 down at home, the players want to resolve it as quickly as possible, and then maybe you lose a bit of control in the match, and that's what happened to us. I think I expect a little bit more maturity from our group. We're an older group, we're a more senior group. I expect our players to maybe show a bit more of those qualities in that kind of situation, rather than rushing things in the way that we did. You know, so many situations where you see players like Bowen get on the ball, Kudus get on the ball, Edson Alvarez get on the ball, and it's kind of like, whoa, how do I get forward as quickly as possible? And it's like, well, you don't need to, you know, and a big part of playing against Brentford and finding success against Brentford is not doing that, because if you do that, you're going to turn the ball over quite a lot, and that's going to play into exactly what they're looking for, which is to get the ball nice and quickly forward into those players that you previously mentioned, which is what happened ultimately. So I think when you know, Potter's spoken about this a lot already, when you don't attack well, it makes it hard to defend well. We did not attack well at all in the first half, and that made it hard for us defensively. I think then when you look at what we did with our press, which you referenced, we were forced to be quite narrow, really. I think that is to do in part with how well Norgard and Janelt kind of moved around the pitch to create space for other players. It's not just about how can we receive the ball, but how can we move to create more space for our centre-backs and more space for our full-backs. I think that was very effective. I think Janelt did a really good job of kind of elongating the gap for Kudus to make up, because Kudus is kind of 2v1 really between Janelt and Sepp van den Berg. I think because the gap becomes so big, we start to see Edson Alvarez coming out of midfield to try and support, to kind of help with Janelt. And then you get into situations where Bowen's kind of trying to stay quite narrow because he doesn't want to leave the midfield completely empty. So you can get a player like Damsgaard just dropping off in the 10 space, no one around him. So you kind of want to avoid that. So the wingers start to, you know, Bowen and Soler start to kind of tuck in a bit more narrow, and then you get the space for Lewis Potter and I, and you see these balls out to the fullbacks all the way through the first half. And lots of straight line running, really, particularly from Lewis Potter. He did a really good job of progressing to the final third for Brentford, exploiting the spaces that they were creating out wide. And yeah, it just needs a little bit of in a game against particularly Brentford, who have so many players deep when they build up. They leave so many players close to their own goal. Sometimes you just need the degree of kind of patience in the game to say, this isn't the moment to go out and press these guys, because if we do try and press, we're going to get forced. Not going to have the numbers to do it effectively, number one, and if we do try and do it, probably going to get forced too narrow to either the middle of the pitch or to one side of the pitch, and they're going to be able to exploit it with the pace that they have, which is what happened.
Yeah, I think also as well the payoff's just not as good, right? I think the benefits of pressing teams where they, I suppose, build up in a slightly more conventional way, or at least conventional in terms of what we see now from those teams, building up in a 3-2 or a 2-3 or whatever, where if you do force a high turnover, there's not so many bodies there to stop you once you've won the ball back. So therefore the quality of chance you're likely to create from forcing the turnover is much higher, because you can attack on an equal footing, or sometimes you might even have the advantage in terms of the numbers. But as you say, with Brentford committing so many men deep in build-up, it always means they've got passing options or more passing options, so it's much more difficult to press, because then you have to commit far more men forward, and then if you do somehow win the turnover, it means they've got 6-7 men there to defend against the transition that you've just tried to create. And then what was it all for, really, apart from either not creating a decent attack, and worst case, which we saw a lot, is failing to press effectively because they've got too many men, and once they've baited you and you've played through, then the amount of men you've committed to the press is too many, and then defensively you're way up against it. And even if it's a 3-on-3, the pace and quality and precision that those three attackers that they've got possess kind of makes it feel like a 4v3 anyway.
It does. I think it's worth, you know, the turnover needs to be really high against Brentford to be successful, because it's in those moments where they split Van den Berg and Collins so wide of Flecken, and Flecken kind of comes out to kind of contribute and build up, not in the way that we see with, like, I don't know, like a Robert Sanchez previously at Brighton, in a very different way, but he's still helping them structurally be really wide in their deep build up. So if you can turn the ball over there, I think, yes, there's an opportunity to generate big chances quickly. I mean, that's always the case. If you can turn the ball over sort of within 30 yards of the opposition's goal, you've got a real opportunity to generate a big chance. If you can't do that, which again is difficult to do because of how wide Brentford go and how many sort of options they have to circulate the ball. It becomes very difficult. And we should talk just briefly about why that's so possible for Brentford as compared to other teams. And this is ultimately quite simple, really, when you look at teams that attack in a very structured, typical way. Generally, the players that are furthest forward are maybe the striker and the number 10, and that pins the centre-backs back. But you can then commit your fullbacks to help support you press, and your wingers can come inside a little bit, and then you get extra bodies to help you support defensively and being really aggressive. But Brentford are really good at stopping that by pushing the wingers so aggressive and so high. So Mbeumo and Chado throughout the game are super high on the last line. It pins our fullbacks back really deep. So Wan-Bissaka and Emerson find it very hard to disconnect and come up and support the press. And actually then it's more about Wissa and Damsgaard picking the moments to drop in. And that exploits then, your centre-backs are probably the players who want to be more comfortable, want to be, deeper, especially when you've got players like Mbeumo and Wissa and Jarrod with the pace to go in behind. So they're more likely to be more conservative. So you end up with kind of like a flat back four across the back. It's difficult for the centre-backs to step out aggressively because of where the wingers are. It's difficult for the full-backs to step out aggressively because of where the wingers are. And then they can exploit that space with Damsgaard, Wissa, whoever it is. Or if you go super narrow to stop them from being able to play into Damsgaard, Wissa, then it's Lewis Potter and Aya that are able to just kind of bomb up and down the flanks. We've seen this previously with Brentford, and actually I think they've kind of recaptured a little bit of what they lost without Henry and Hickey through Lewis Potter. Like, typically the thing with Brentford always was that they had all these bodies centrally, and your defence pinned so deep with the pace that they had to go in behind, that you'd just see this big diag over to Rico Henry in loads of space that would just go steaming up the flank. And it's been a while since I've seen that with Brentford because it's been centre-backs playing in the full-back positions.
Joachim Andersen to Anthony Robinson this season, right? It's the same sort of dynamic of just ping the ball out to the left back where you've got Iwobi and everyone committing inside, Pereira floating around. It's a very similar sort of method, but one that Brentford are as equipped to do. But as you say, we all thought maybe they wouldn't be when Rico Henry disappeared, and all of a sudden Keane Lewis Potter, who I had down as a 10-stroke winger for most of his youth career, right, has turned into a fairly stand-up left-back, certainly in possession.
Yeah, definitely from an in-possession perspective. Look, I want to land in this sort of top section on a question about sort of how we approach the game then, because if we're critical of sort of the way that we pressed from the start, the way that we used the ball from the start, it would seem that, from a managerial level, we've got the plan wrong for the game. But I think we both think on this one occasion, and it really is one occasion, that perhaps it was fair for Potter to kind of assess the group in those conditions. It might be a little bit unfair to suggest that he should take all of his evidence based on what was done under the previous manager, and a little bit unfair on the players as well to do that. And therefore, perhaps they deserve the opportunity to kind of step out, be aggressive, see what happens. And obviously we know what the answer was.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think he sort of alluded to it in the post-match press conference as well. We were there and he was talking about, he was quite keen to impress the fact that it was the first time that he'd had Jarrod, Kudus and Paquetá on the pitch together. And I think, as you say, he's probably earned the right, but also the players over the course of their careers have earned the right to be given another chance to do it. I think also him on a personal level will be backing himself and asking those questions of, well, actually, I'm a good coach. I probably back myself to teach pressing triggers and my pressing system to be more effective than what I saw Lopetegui was able to do with this squad. So if I teach them my instructions, are they going to be able to exercise it to a higher degree than they were Lopetegui's? And as you say, the answer played out to be no, for the reasons that we know, because the midfield doesn't really have the legs in its current makeup to cover all the ground that's required. But yeah, I think it made sense to try it. I think we were discussing after the press conference about when, if he didn't try it now, would he try it? Because if you look at the games coming up, it'd be kind of even riskier to do it.
Leicester is the only one, I think, for the next home game. Maybe that would have been a better opportunity to do this sort of thing, particularly with maybe Evan Ferguson up to speed at that time. But apart from that, it is difficult to find fixtures in the Premier League where you can kind of say, this team's probably going to want to sit deeper for periods of the game and we're going to get a chance to have 55, 60, 65 even % of the ball.
Yeah, and I think as well, if you're going to test it, it's kind of the idea of like baptism of fire, right? Thrown in the deep end. It's like, well, if they can do it against Brentford, then they can probably do it against most teams, because most teams aren't Brentford when it comes to this. But if they can't do it, then we've got some questions, and it will probably be the easiest game to assess in post with regards to, okay, why couldn't we do it? Okay, it's very, very obvious that the reason here is lack of legs in midfield. I can't commit that many bodies forward and then expect everyone to get back in transition, because it's not going to work. Also, a good test of how the defence function. Are the defence able to cover that amount of ground? How high can I actually afford to put my defensive line? And then that in tandem will impact how sort of advanced the actual press itself is. How compact is the pitch going to be, etc. So I think we kind of came to the conclusion that whilst it's frustrating to not pick up the win, one step back rather, is probably fine if we then see numerous lessons learned and then actioned upon moving forward. The one step back to then take those steps forward is fine. He has to appraise the squad at some point. It's an unfortunate position for any manager to come in, because rather than appraising over a summer, he's got to appraise on the fly in the league, really, because you can't test this kind of thing in training. It's just not possible on the training pitch. You have to do it in game. Brentford, one of the best teams at cutting teams apart that try and do this. So, yeah, I think he will have learnt a lot. Even just listening to him after the game, he sounded like he'd learnt a lot. He sounded like he learnt who would be able to do this and who wouldn't. I think my gut is that there's probably a lot of work to be done, both on and off the pitch. But yeah, I think it would be easy to just go, oh, he got it all wrong, he got it all wrong, he got it all wrong this game. But I think there probably was an element of, you know what, let's give it a go. We're at home. In theory, we should be the winning team, so why should I compromise my ideals? But I think he's probably quickly found out why maybe he should have a little bit.
Well, if he didn't compromise too much in the first half, there were big compromises in the second half, and they worked quite well, didn't they? I think, I suppose one of the reasons we're able to have this discussion in this way and able to land on a point like that in the top section is because of how quickly it was remedied in the second half with really clear, good solutions for all of the issues that came up in the first half. And through Ward-Prowse, Ferguson and Scholes, I think we were able to achieve a much better level of performance in the second period.
Yeah, 100%. I think the two most obvious points for me were Ferguson and Ward-Prowse. I think you can combine somewhat, because I think we were discussing the importance of defending with the ball. Potter kept talking about the idea of retention and how we need to make better decisions in attack, and I read that implication of we need to not try and attack all the time, and we need to wait for the right moment to attack. And the introduction of Ward-Prowse certainly made that much more possible. He was looking to get on the ball a lot, but not because he wanted to just drive the team forward in the way that sort of sometimes Paquetá looks to get on the ball often because he's frustrated at the fact that we're not going forward quickly enough for him. Whereas I think Ward-Prowse was trying to get on the ball often to just keep it ticking over, which is what we needed to do to sort of find those moments.
It's the value of the golden sideways pass.
It is, exactly. It's why Nova was so good. Bring him back. And then Ferguson, I think, is retention in a different way, in that when we were trying to go forward and play into feet against those centre-backs, it was always going to be difficult for Paquetá. But I think just generally the sort of hold-up that Ferguson can offer, whilst also offering all of the sort of drop and facilitate stuff that Paquetá does so well in that role, having that combination, it does mean that when you do play forward, you're retaining the ball more often, rather than trying to play forward, oh look, it's not stuck, and now the ball's at the feet of Italiano, who's now going to play forward and feed that counter, whereas Ferguson just picks it up and then rolls it back out, and then we can attack again.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying as well, when you say that there were some moments in the first half where we probably did get it right, where we moved the ball quite nicely around the defence, into midfield, back into defence, drew the press all the way up. We draw Norgard out. There was one situation where we drew Norgard out and Ayer, and still found time on the ball for Kilman. Did the right thing, played the ball over the top of that lot, into the front line, into a 3v3, which was Paquetá, Bowen and Kudus up against Vandenberg, Collins and Ayer. Vandenberg, Collins and Lewis Potter, which is really advantageous for us if you can take the first ball down. And the big thing that we just couldn't do in that first half was take that first ball down off of 9. Paquetá wasn't able to do it. And if you put that in context of where we have seen him do it and where he didn't do it in this game, it's not so much, fluctuation of individual form. It's just coming up against really physically dominant centre-backs versus coming up against less dominant physical centre-backs. In this game, you've got two players that I think both played really, really well, but have a good record of just winning loads of aerial duels. Sepp van den Berg's rate is not super impressive this season. It's actually quite poor, but his just raw number of aerials won is super impressive. And Collins is very much the same. He's been super duel dominant this season. So I think, we saw him do it against Villa, against Ezri Konsa and Luca Dean, which is a different thing. Players that aren't super dominant aerial defenders, physical defenders. And the questions that were asked of him are different in this game, and that's why it's so difficult. And you're right to say that, the combination of the two, Ward-Prowse helping us settle better, deeper. So many situations actually where it's like not just bounce passes back to the centre-backs, but like we get through, get turned in behind the front two for Brentford, and Ward-Prowse's first thought is not, I'm going to go and dribble, or I'm going to go and play straight into one of the forwards. It's, I'm going to wait for Lucas Paquetá to complete that 5-yard shuttle run backwards towards me, and then I'm going to play 4-yard pass sideways to him and let him do what he does. And that helped us hugely. And like you say, Ferguson's ability to kind of do both, hold the ball up, drop towards the ball, but also as well, the last thing you didn't mention, also give us a bit of depth, some runs in behind as well, a little bit of pace, which we saw, really nice turn of pace to create that chance for Kudus, which he should have put away. Just real good combination, which you get from, we've just lacked that all season. We've been playing really without a focal point in that way, with that combination of abilities that you get out of someone who's a natural striker, and we haven't had that for a while at West Ham. Mikel Antonio did an unbelievable job, and you have to call him a number 9 because of how well he did as a number 9 after moving there in his career, but was unconventional as a number 9, did other kinds of things, or roll wider and dragged centre-backs into positions they don't want to be in and dribbled them, and provided the physical qualities too, but just not that really traditional kind of combination of things that you get out of a top player. Even just Ferguson receiving on the edge of the box, and receiving in a way that then allows him to shoot with his second touch. So that first touch that takes it on the turn into the gap between the centre-back and the full-back, so you can immediately shoot across goal. We saw that twice in the game. I can't really think of many times I've seen it before at West Ham over the last 3-4 years. It's not been something that's been part of our game so much. We've had to rely on sort of different ways of generating chances, haven't been able to kind of look at the number 9 as someone who can just get a snapshot off of their own quality receiving around the edge of the box, which Ferguson gave us. Really impressive performance from him, really impressive from Ward-Prowse, who brought, I think, other issues in the game. We're going to talk about those on Extra Time, patreon.com/Analytics United, 7-day free trial. Over there, we do a whole second half of the podcast focusing on individual performances, and there's some interesting stuff to break into with Ward-Prowse. There's more stuff to talk about with Ollie Skiles. There's more stuff to talk about with lots of players, really. I'd love to talk about Lucas Paquetá in more depth, and I'm going to get to in about half an hour. But I want to sort of move on to sort of the broader takeaways here. If what we're saying from the second half is we're able to get a bit more control, we're able to play with a sort of better tempo, we're able to arrive in the final third more often, control the game, have more of the game played in the final third. But we've had to make some changes to be able to do that. And you look at some of the players that particularly someone like Ward-Prowse, who, like I say, brought other issues in the second half. We always know with Ward-Prowse sort of defending what's behind him is not one of his biggest qualities, and can sometimes introduce a little bit of weakness through the centre of the pitch to sort of direct vertical passes. I think we know that there's quite a big gap for this group to make up, and it's worth saying as well, with the whole context of the second half, Brentford's performance was very different, but still very good. Still understood exactly how they needed to play. The game changed. For the first 15 minutes, we had nearly 70% of the ball in the first 15 minutes of the second half. And they understood it was about sitting lower, defending as a unit, being aggressive in the right areas, in the box, around the edge of the box. And executing at a high level to be able to protect their box, protect their goal, which they did incredibly well for the most part. So I think on reflection, I think we should talk just about how much work there is to do, because usually at the end of the pods, we talk about sort of lessons learned. And you've spoken a lot already today about Potter will have learned a lot about the group. He was talking afterwards about clearly seemed like he'd learned a lot from the game, and it's very frustrating, I'm sure, for West Ham fans listening to this podcast, thinking, how many games in are we? I mean, it's not the start of a season, and we're still talking about learning about things and how much can we learn about the group and so on and so forth. And results are not coming, points are not coming, and it feels like the gap to anything that feels respectable is getting, not respectable, but feels like an okay takeaway from the season is getting bigger. We haven't been competitive in the cup competitions, and the gap to the lot at the bottom isn't getting much smaller, but feels more nerve wracking with results like that. And I totally understand that. And the lessons are very much the same, really, aren't they? They're the same lessons we've been talking about all season. So, yeah, we should talk about what needs to be done.
We need a goalkeeper. we need a goalkeeper, and we need to revamp the midfield, probably in its entirety. To be honest, I think Ward-Prowse coming on and doing a good job was great, but as you say, I think for various other reasons, there for every upside there is a downside. I think with Ward-Prowse.
He's not a 23-year-old kid who's going to keep getting better.
Well, exactly. This is it. To pin your hopes on him. Maybe I guess if I was going to put a positive glint on it, it's that for next season he can probably do a job and probably buys you time, and that you don't necessarily have to buy two midfielders. You can maybe get away with buying one to start alongside him, with Ward-Prowse being the retention-focused one, and then someone to sit alongside him who's a bit more of a Basuma profile, who can do the progressive passing but really is a ball-winning, dominant jeweler. But the more I add, the more difficult it is to find the profile.
Is that worth 10 million?
No, I found a little guy in Ecuador, lad. It's fine. He's only like 2 mil. I haven't, but I will. Yeah, and then goalkeeper, I think, is obvious. I think we see it game in, game out, regardless of who's in between the sticks, whether it's Fabianski or Areola. The distribution is just not. I mean, even in this game, as we've already said, Flecken, he's not an Edison, he's not an Alisson type, but he's comfortable receiving the ball deep and not getting flustered and pinging it out. He'll still find the pass to the centre back or the full back. I
did find one really nice pass actually over the whole defence, which Wan-Bissaka did a very good job to defend in the end.
His long
was almost in his Edison bag there.
It is good enough, but I think it's just those moments. That there was one moment. Well, there was a couple moments, to be honest, but where I think Areola was in a similar position to Flecken when he received the ball, sort of probably 5 or 6 yards ahead of the byline, but like out wide in the corner of the box, and would have been quite easy to just find a centre-back into feet if he had confidence in his ability to then receive the ball back again once the players have moved around him, and then he's got more space the second time to then distribute under less pressure. But instead he just tried a sort of lofted sort of short pass, a square pass, I guess, on FIFA, or an X pass if you play Xbox, but just didn't go anywhere. It just went. I think one went out for a throw, one went out into space, and then Brentford picked it up. And I was just like, the system is not.
The most egregious one was the one that was for Kudus, and then Lewis Potter. I think it was Lewis Potter just came in steaming over the top of it. Won the ball about 30 yards from goal.
It's just not the system. Really, under Potter needs to start at the back, right? And I think without really investing in that position next season, bringing in a sort of out-and-out starter, ideally someone that has a track record of being quite a vocal goalkeeper as well, because I think our defence is quite quiet. We don't really have a leader back there. I think Kilman leads by example with his performances, but he's not an organiser. So I think that would be something that I'd be looking for, but obviously prioritise the ball-playing aspect of it all. Obviously, as we want a positive shot stopper, I'm not going to bring someone in who's shipped 100 goals just because he can play a 30-yard pass every time. But yeah, I think that's it. The priority for me would be goalkeeper and sort of just fix up the midfield so that it can at least keep up with the pace of play and cover those sort of yards that Potter's willing to leave because of how the system wants to function.
And do you feel, we often have this discussion about sort of the same lessons about the group, and the expense that's required basically to get it up to scratch technically, and also athletically, to be able to compete with other teams that have similar ideas about how they want to execute their plan to win matches in the Premier League. Do you feel that it's feasible to be able to achieve all of the work that needs to be done in one summer to kind of catch up with some of the teams that, because ultimately West Ham is, as a club, we want to be competing with teams that are flowing around the top 8, top 10 this season. And I think when you look at us right now in this moment, and you look at the game that we've just played against Brentford, the first half, it was a real indication of how far it actually is to some of those teams. And when you talk about it in terms of, like all you need to do is shove a goalkeeper in who's, vocal, great on the ball, and a great shot stopper. They don't come around too often. And what you also need is you need a midfielder who can, get around the whole pitch, destroy everything, and progress the ball forward as well. They don't come around too often either. Is it actually? We can say these things. These are nice things to say, and these are qualities that the midfield needs and the team needs. The goal that we need in a goalkeeper. The question I have is it doable?
It's difficult for sure. It's definitely difficult. I think I always sort of go back round, and this is it's become such a cliched point now, right? But like, I often look at things like this. Brighton being the obvious example, right, where it seems on paper for us that it would be almost impossible because of the squad players that we have here, who our best players are, and I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. It's not about, I don't think, that you can't find those players. I think with the arrival of Kyle McCauley, you'd probably back yourself to find them more than we would have done. I think Potter himself has a very good eye for a talent, and certainly an eye for a profile that he needs and can get something out of. And everything that's been reported suggests that he'll play a fairly important role in recruitment, I think, just by way of his relationship with McCauley and their understanding of each other. I'm not saying Potter's going to be sat on Y-Scout going, Kyle, go and get me this lad, I've found him, he looks great, but there's going to be a sort of connection there. And I think that part's fine. And like I say, I go back to the point of, well, I'm not being funny, but Brighton did it. Yes, okay, they've got the structure, they've got the infrastructure, they've got the scouting networks, they've got the relationships, they've got the multi-club model, etc. That all helps.
And one last thing they also had is they had time.
Yes. Yeah,
this is difficult. Their model hasn't been about, we need to go from here to top 6.
Yeah.
Like that. And they're still not there. Ultimately still often for Brighton, it becomes a case of not quite having enough to break that sort of top 7 region. They recruit really well, have lots of really good young players, but they often find themselves just about falling short, because when it comes to the teams you have to then beat, the teams above you that you have to then beat, you have to execute at such a high level to be able to pick up points off of. Do they do that consistently enough is always really the question at the end of a season for Brighton about breaking into Europe and actually, mounting a European challenge and stuff that should be within the realms of possibility for Brighton. But a big thing, those are 2 points I've made there. One is time. The expectations aren't all the way up here. There's actually this curve that's possible because they're coming from a different level to try and be competitive at the top end of the Premier League. And the other one is about, actually how competitive are they at the top end of the Premier League?
Yeah, I think, I suppose, again, with my positive hat on, is that I would argue that, yes, the time is different in terms of where, like, we have a much more pressing need to be successful now, I would say, partly because we've tasted success and partly because the bar is just higher for what we expect to achieve. But then I would also say that our starting point is different. We have recently been in Europe. We have recently had consecutive top 8, etc. finishes, and the baseline of player that we're working with in some areas of the squad is higher. And I think the players that we can bring in are higher because you're having the opportunity to play in front of 60,000 people every week in London on high wages. So I think in that respect, you can sort of speed up that process by bringing in sort of more of the finished article, not the players that, the Kuduses, for example, the players that this is their next stop before going to the big sort of team, but instead of buying the next Moises Caicedo from I don't know, Ecuador, you can actually just go to Italy and go, oh, well, there's this guy in the Serie A, or go to the Eredivisie or whatever, and sort of the ones that are slightly
expensive,
above.
Though. Expensive. It
For
costs
sure.
a lot of money.
For sure. But again, I think, sadly, the place we've arrived at is when you've got teams like Bournemouth that are now able to spend £40 million on a striker. It's expensive for everyone, really. The money, if you want to compete, and that's irrespective of tactic, I would say. They're spending this money to create a really effective counter-attacking system because the players that their manager demands for his system to work. And I think even those players are commanding lofty fees now, which is kind of nuts. So I think it is possible. It's always going to be expensive because everyone has money now. If you exist in the Premier League, teams outside of the Premier League are going to fleece you, and teams in the Premier League are going to charge you even more. So ultimately, it is going to be a very difficult and very expensive transition. And as I say, I think my biggest concern isn't that the players aren't out there. I think that we've done a pretty good job over January of finding players that would be good fits. I know Macaulay will have much further, wider reaching targets in every position. It's not that. I think every club will do. I think the issue is how we get there. For me, that's the biggest worry, is that I look at the squad and who our most important players are, and Paquetá and Kudus and Bowen, and think, well, actually, how many of you are actually made for this system? And I think that's probably the bigger concern, is not that we couldn't do it and we couldn't get a squad that could do it. It's that the place that we're building from is such a sort of stark shift from where we've been, if that makes sense. Whereas the benefit of Brighton is that it's always been the same ever since Chris Hughton left. They've always been building around a similar sort of model. So even though those changes have happened, it's not been a massive, massive shock to the system when players leave, because you're building around the same sort of environment and ecosystem.
I had to put a break in somewhere, and I'm sorry everyone, it's come right there. It's sort of in a weird place in the podcast. I have to apologise to Charlie as well. He's going to be editing this. Right towards the end, there are a couple of points I want to pick up on that you made in that last section. I think the first one that I'll pick up on is kind of, I'll try and do this briefly, is that I think we often talk quite a lot of the time about trying to find sort of undervalued talent. Mm-hmm. And I think that is one thing. I mean, you mentioned about it's sort of expensive, whatever you're trying to do in the Premier League. I think that's one thing I would just slightly disagree on. And I think that that's evidenced by Anthony Elanga, Callum Hudson-Odoi, Nikola Milenkovic, Ola Aina, all come in at Forest, all made a big difference. Not a massive expense across the board for most of those players. Why were they undervalued? Because they don't really do the things that the top teams that want to dominate games from the sort of 3-box-3 style model that we're now implementing, they don't really do those things. And they do different things that mean that they're maybe not so valued by some of the top teams, and maybe it's a little bit easier to have a cleaner run at them, and maybe they should be valued higher, but you end up not entering bidding wars. The price is kind of staying in a flat position. That's kind of what happened with Elanga and Hudson-Odoi, particularly two really good examples where just weren't many buyers, and the price ends up coming down quite a lot, and you end up getting players that can offer a huge amount of output and value for not huge cost. And then there's players like Ryan Christie at Bournemouth. He's become kind of like a fix-everything, fix-all midfielder for that kind of style. Does so many of the things that you'd want a midfielder to do if you're going to play that way. Costs them barely anything. So I think there are more opportunities to find players that can offer a huge amount in the Premier League when you want to do things maybe a little bit differently. And I think we showed that doing things differently. And I should be very clear about this. There's not one way to do things differently. There are lots of ways to do things differently, but we did things differently under David Moyes and found similar utility out of players like Craig Dawson for not very much money, Vladimir Sofal for not very much money, and Thomas Soucek in the grand scheme of things for not very much money either. So I think that is more possible. I think it's more possible to find solutions if they're different for less than you would find them for when you're shopping in the same market as a lot of those big teams who want the same kinds of players, who are also, and really importantly, hoovering up a lot of the best young players. So a lot of the players that we spoke about on Transfer Factory over January, they're owned by Man City because they play for Girona or they play for another Man City associated club. or they're owned by Chelsea because they play at Strasbourg, or they're on a buyback from Man United at Benfica, or they're on a buyback from Real Madrid somewhere, or they're on a buyback from Man City at Ipswich. Like a lot of the players are already owned by some of the young talented players that can do enough of the things that would make them valuable asset to that kind of team. They're already bought at 18, 19, 20. And if they haven't been, they're going to be soon. I mean, Chelsea have operated with that model even more aggressively than ever before over the last couple of years. So I think it gets even more difficult because those teams know what they've got and they drive the prices up even higher and make it more difficult for you to recruit those kind of players that would allow you to close the gap to them playing in that style. So I think it's got harder than it maybe previously was. And the other point you made at the end there, you began to talk about was Bowen, was Kudus, was Paquetá. That's the big question I want to finish on today. Did we learn a new lesson about those three players in this game? And it's not really about their level of performance. We're going to talk about them on ET. I don't think we think Kudus had his best game. I think we thought Bowen was slightly better. I think we thought Paquetá was a lot better. I think it was probably the best of the three. Varying levels of performance in this game. But the key thing for me is there's no output. There's no output. I haven't scored a goal out of the three of them. And a huge part of what we struggled with in the first half in this game was, as much as we thought that these players, and I still believe these three players have all of the talent, all of the technical qualities to be able to operate in a different kind of way to how they operated previously under a manager like Moyes, where things are maybe a little bit more direct, things happen at more speed, and they need to be a little bit more conservative in the decision making. They need to pick the right moment to attack directly and the right moment to retain the ball. They've got all of the right technical qualities to do that. I just think this was a clear example of them failing to do it as a trio against Brentford. It was just too many decisions geared towards speeding things up every time any of those three players received the ball, that it undermined a lot of the control that we could have maybe taken in the first half of that match. And then the key thing following on from that is their output's just gone this season. The output, the goals and assists for these players has just gone this season. Bowen has about managed to keep some kind of turnover there, but we've traded out probably a combined, when you come to the end of the season, probably a combined maybe 10 goal contributions for maybe 7 or 8 extra touches a game and a couple of extra progressive actions. And this was a really good example of that in this game, where he was kind of shunted out wide to enable someone like Kudus to do what he does in central areas. He does a lot of receiving on the halfway line, and you end up with the output being where previously, he's running in behind, he's scoring goals for the team. He's now cutting inside and desperately trying to whip balls into the box and against settled defences and trying to unlock something in that kind of way, which is, he's a very good player and he can do that, but it doesn't really bring out his best qualities. Ultimately, these are three players that can do an incredible amount when it comes to generating goal-scoring situations or scoring for their teams.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I think where I'm sort of landing at the minute, and I'm willing to obviously give it more time because we still very much are in the infancy of the Graham Potter era, particularly with these players, but I'm increasingly of the opinion that I'm not sure there's space in a squad for a Bowen and a Kudus to maximise both players. I think you can fit both in.
Well, unless you play on the counter-attack, mate.
Yeah, but this is true.
That's my point.
Yeah.
There is a way to fit all three of them in if you play a different style.
Yeah.
Where you want them to speed things up all of the time.
Yeah. No, that is true. Even then, I would argue that still one of them you wouldn't be... Well, then it's just a case of what side of the pitch they're on, though, isn't it? They're still effective.
It is, and it's who you partner them with. It's whether you put like a Manu Lanzini type in with them and have one of them playing as the striker, or whether you put a striker who brings great control as a target man who can drop and slow things down for you, which is ultimately was the idea when we signed Gianluca Scamacca. Like that was the thought.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tricky one because I understand. It's the classic paradox, right? It's the classic Cal Jack paradox. I understand the direction we're trying to head in. I think my previous conceptions of the sustainability of counter-attacking football, which were largely based on what we saw with Moyes, where we punched above our weight, and then in the league, teams very quickly found out how to play against us, and we suddenly plummeted down the table. That sort of informed my notion of, well, eventually when you reach the heights of punching above your weight by playing counter-attacking football, there has to be a point where you transition to a team that wants to control more of the variables, that wants to limit the opposition rather than the opposition limit you, but you just work out how to be super potent in those limited moments. Yeah, there has to be a moment where you pivot. I think we handled the pivot very badly initially. I think this is probably the move we should have made before Lopetegui. I think we all probably agree on that now anyway. If you agree that we were pivoting in the right direction, I think that's probably where the two of us don't necessarily agree. I think maybe you would have doubled down and just said, okay, we're going to invest all this money. Why not just become better and better at what we were good at, rather than saying, oh, what we were good at stopped working and therefore we need to go in a completely different direction. What I would say is that's where I was at. And I think Bournemouth and Forest maybe this season have made me wonder whether I was right. I think ultimately with that, I probably still land more in the camp of, I think pivoting towards controlling more variables is still the side of the fence that I sit on. Probably just from my sort of more data heavy brain, where if I can control more than mathematically, I am less vulnerable. But from a squad point of view, I can understand where you're at on that side of the debate, because I think the system that we've gone with doesn't maximise what we've got. It just has the potential to maximise the team if we get it all right. But for me, that probably looks like we have to shift a bunch of players on now to fill those gaps. And that's a huge hypothetical and a huge risk, because how many times have Premier League players signed players that we thought would all be amazing and then have just been not amazing? A lot of the time, it's a huge, huge risk. And ultimately, I think if the Bournemouth and the Forest stuff continues and is sustainable and goes beyond a couple of seasons, if they double down in the way that we didn't and it continues to work, then I probably would be moving more towards your direction. But at the minute, I'm yet to fully go there, because I do still believe that with the right investment and the right recruitment, which I don't think we've done, then it could have worked. And I'm hoping that that's the direction we're heading in now. Basically, I just want to hit skip and get to the summer and then have this conversation.
Yeah, there are a few things I should clarify very briefly, and we're over time. Producer screaming in my ear.
I also look like I've been on the sunbeds because the sun has started to go down. And the lights just got brighter and brighter on my face.
So I'm going to go really, really quickly, and I apologise, everyone. I'm going to run this straight through into the outro. I should clarify. One, I think Potter's a brilliant manager, and I don't think he's the wrong pick for West Ham. I think in the right circumstances with the right players, I think we see a good level, and I think we see a manager that could be very, very successful at West Ham. My question is over whether that's going to come, whether that level of talent, technical and athletic ability is going to be achievable to find within our squad over the period that it will be required, and whether actually it will take longer, and whether we have the patience as a club to wait the amount of time it would really take to have the degree of turnover that we really need to get the squad into a position where we can compete in that kind of way in the top 8 again. I don't think it's a summer. I think it's longer. I don't like ever not getting the best out of your best assets. I don't see it as style first and sort of maximization of talent and results later. I see it the other way around. I see maximization of talent and finding results as the guiding element of how you find your style. So that is just a different way of kind of viewing the whole structure of how you kind of build out a club to be successful. And I don't think this season, this isn't something that's emerged just now in the Brentford. I think all season long, I don't think we've done a good job of maximising our best players. And I think we've landed in a position now where we've got a fan base that questions some of our most talented players, questions lots of our really talented players and the level of talent that they actually have. when really I think we've done a really poor job as a club of making them look good. And I think there are many players below the very top end. We've been talking about our fantastic attackers. But actually, I think, there are lots of players that would be serviceable to a different kind of squad, playing a different kind of way, that have shown that previously at West Ham. Thomas Soucek, Edson Alvarez. I think Maximilian Kilman has all of the attributes to be fantastic. I think Aaron Wan-Bissaka has all the attributes to be fantastic as well. James Ward-Prowse, player that we just got rid of in the summer because it made sense to, because he wasn't the right kind of player for Lopetegui. Lopetegui wouldn't have enjoyed using him all that much. But that's not maximising a squad. You don't sign someone for 30, 35 million or however much it was, and have them as a core part of your squad, have them perform really well in the Premier League one season, and then go, yeah, he's gone because we've decided we're going to play a different way. Like, I don't see that as proper or sensible management. I think sustainability is a question not just of how long can we compete at the top level for, but how can we look after our players and our finances in a way that allows us to be competitive, maybe not every single year in a row, but competitive over a much longer period of time. So I don't mean consecutive years. I just clarified that. I mean, maybe one year you are breaking the top six and maybe one year you're not breaking the top six, but you have the opportunity to do that every other season or every season. It might not work out every season. And then I also think, and the last thing I would clarify is, it's not just counter-attacking. For me, what we threw out, and the wrong thing to throw out was the idea of directness. We started to sort of, we have drifted away from this idea of directness as being something that's useful. I think directness is really, really useful. I think that's proven if you look at a lot of the teams that have broken the top six, top seven over the last 8 years. I think directness is an incredible asset to have if you can do it well and if you have the right players to do it well. I think we can do it well, and I think we have the right players to do it well. It doesn't have to be with 25% of the ball. It does not have to look like that. And I think managers like Iraola have done a really good job of proving that it doesn't have to be like that. And De Zerbi, by the way, who used the ball really slowly around the defence, but then moved it very quickly using a series of diagonal passes into the front line, and then used the direct qualities of his front line very well to get good results for Brighton. So I think directness is the key for me, and it's a very, very good way to upset the quality, the established quality, and the financial might of the teams that sit above you in the Premier League. This is a conversation that needs to go on much longer. It is the classic Jack and Cal oppositional debate.
The dichotomy.
But we will continue it, and we're going to go on and talk about individual performances now in extra time. Talk about this a little bit more. Darcy's going to have a chance to weigh in too. So if you want to hear more about this stuff, and you want to hear about Ollie Scarles, which you should, and head over to patreon.com/Analytics United. We'd love to see you there. Loads of stuff going on over there, not just extra time, but preview pods, Euro review, which is an entire show that I do every week, looking at a team from around Europe or two teams from around Europe and exploring all of their players. Player of the week, FPL stuff. There's a whole bundle of things that happen over on the Patreon that we do every week. We're really proud of it, and really grateful for the number of people who've signed up recently. It's great to see the development of a lovely community over there. So thank you for tuning into this podcast. It's another long one. We always seem to go long when we lose a game.
I wonder why.
Yes, but yeah. If not, if you don't join us over there, we'll see you next week, hopefully to discuss. I was going to say hopefully to discuss a good result against Arsenal, but that feels like a tough game after the way that they recovered in the later minutes against Leicester. Mikel Merino suddenly one of the best nines in the league. All right, see you then.
Adios.